Now we will turn to the issue of risk assessment and precisely of the narratives that surround new genetic engineering techniques. And we have a pleasure to have with us Dr. Christoph Then, who is the Executive Director of TESS Biotech and the coordinator of a coalition No Patents on Seeds. With a background in veterinary science, Christoph has been working for about 20 years on issues in the field of biotechnology. And his presentation will indeed address issues around the EFSA report, the European Food Safety Authority report, and the proposed risk assessment requirements. Christoph, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. I was told I can tell you everything, but it should not take longer than 10 minutes, so I try to be short, and apologies to the translators. I'm representing TESS Biotech in this meeting. TESS Biotech is following science from the perspective of the health, of the protection goals, such as human health and the environment and nature. And we just recently published a report, and we were pleased that our report was published, which was written by us. And so you can find it online, and you can read what I might have omitted or not explained properly. Next slide. How does this work? Nothing does work. What was wrong with this? Okay, now it looks better. Okay. So the main findings from this report are that the differences between conventional breeding and the new genomic techniques might be easily overlooked, but they might also have severe consequences if they are overlooked. So we describe the differences, and we describe the intended and the unintended differences on genetic level, on the level of the organism, and the level of the environment. And we found out that EFSA never had a mandate to fully assess the unintended effects. That's a quote you see at the right-hand side, yeah. They committed themselves. So we think it's a risk that the European Commission will come to the wrong conclusions based on lack of data or lack of scrutiny. Next slide. Okay. So one reason for the unintended effects are the complex mechanisms to perform new genomic techniques. First step is a multi-step process, and the first step, for example, you first have to integrate the DNA for the gene scissor into the cells. So we have a transgenic plant inheriting the DNA of a gene scissor. Of course, this also goes along with unintended effects. Next slide. And as a risk, if these unintended effects escape the attention, are exemplified in the case of a dehorned cattle, which in his genome had a bacterial DNA, which was overlooked by the researchers and also by the authorities in Brazil. And if you use such a cattle for further breeding, these unintended effects will quickly spread throughout populations, and then large populations of, in this case, animals will be affected, and you take measures to slaughter them, maybe, as it was the case finally with this dehorned cattle. It was slaughtered and its offspring before it could be used in breeding, but this could also have been done in the opposite way. So next slide. So we think, because it's such a complex technology, we think all intended genetic changes, all unintended genetic changes have to undergo risk assessment, as well as all intended effects, unintended effects, which may be immediate, delayed, or cumulative. And this is exactly what is requested by the current GMO regulation, and we think this should be applied. But, next slide, we are also afraid that the European Commission, based on lack of sufficient assessment, might come to the conclusion that in future the system gets fragmented and no longer the unintended effects are really assessed. So this would mean that many unintended effects could come to the market unintendedly and then spread throughout the populations. Next slide. We also did some further risks issues. We think also that we should also have a systematic approach on this and look to the overall picture of the releases into the environment. And there we see that a large range of species is involved with a large number of different traits. And so we have to think about how to control this in terms of scale of releases, number of releases, and type of releases. Next slide. So if we're not able to do this, we will end up in a mess. The ecosystems might reach to a tipping point where they collapse due to the sheer amount of releases of organisms which are not adopted by evolutionary processes. And of course, next slide, if you would introduce many of them into a shared environment, this will be accelerated and potentiated. It's getting much more complex. These are findings from a recent conference you also can find online. It was conducted by Project Engineering and the Environment, these slides. Next slide. So we also did some research on socio-economical impacts, and there we are warning about disruptive effects, and some of them are on consumer choice, and others are regarding patents. And on patents, we just want to highlight very shortly that it's not only patents. Next slide. Oh, sorry, no, I shouldn't escape this one. Social and economical impacts, and the need, sorry for that, this slide now, sorry, this slide now goes back to what was explained already by the previous speaker. It's necessary to distinguish in regard to socio-economical impacts whether the benefits are just empty promises or whether there are really potential real benefits in the end. And we exemplify this problem on wheat resulting from genome editing processes. And we find out, for example, that this wheat, which might have a strong trait, an extreme trait, in showing some tolerance to fungal disease, on the other hand, have a trade-off, which makes them much more susceptible for biotic and abiotic stressors in the environment. So this might then be counterproductive to reach really the sustainable goals and the pesticide-free agriculture if these traits are extreme in a way that they compromise the vigor of the plants. And now let's go back to the patent issue. Next slide now. We're also warning about the disruptive effects patents may have. And we want to warn about it's not only patents on the technology, but next slide, it's also patents, next slide, patents on the biological resources needed by all breeders. This is a patent application by Syngenta covering 5,000 single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, detected in wild relative of soybeans, and company Syngenta claims them all plants inheriting them, derived from breeding, not the original wild relatives, but all plants derived from breeding and technology approved, no matter whether this is conventional breeding or technology. And this means, or by new genomic techniques, this means that no traditional breeder and also no expert in new genomic techniques can use these biological resources now anymore if this patent is granted. And several of these patents, which have an overlap to conventional breeding, are already granted. Next slide. So these are the claims saying, well, we want to have all these plants with all these genetic information. Next slide. So this is my last slide. I hope it's still in time. I do not see a watch, but you will tell me. So we think we should keep on with case-by-case risk assessment, fully apply the risk assessment as foreseen by the European regulation, maybe adopted, but also introduce now technology assessment to see whether this is real benefits or just empty promises. And only if both levels of scrutiny are coming to a positive result, we might consider to release it, and only under these conditions also the technology, if there are any, could develop its supposed benefits. Thank you very much for this possibility to give you this overview.
Thank you very much, Christoph, and also for keeping the time. I must say that it sounds a bit quite surprising that EFSA was not even mandated to look at the unintended effects of genetic engineering processes when we know that it's one of the main reasons for concerns, which is also widely reported in the scientific literature. And thank you for raising the issue of patents on seeds as well. It's an aspect which is often overlooked and not addressed at all by the European Commission when it considers this potential deregulation of new genetic engineering techniques. And both your organization, No Patents on Seeds, your coalition, and Via Campesina, I must say as well, have issued recently a very interesting report on this crucial aspect, which is a clear threat as well to the European model of plant breeding